Hello, welcome, switched on. Thank you very much for listening in. And if you're here, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel with the right hand click below. Today is my very first Zoom podcast, and that is going to be with a chap called NickPope. Now, Nick was a MOD, Ministry of Defence ufologist, and that was part of what he did, was trying to discover unidentified flying objects and if they were genuine or not. And now I've got a Zoom call with him following this intro from the deserts in Arizona, where we're going to have a good chat about unidentified flying objects, alien life, etc. So if this floats your boat and you're interested in it, make sure you click and watch the show. Thank you. Well, Nick, thank you very much for coming on Zoom today. It's fantastic to have you on. I've done a little intro beforehand to attach it to the podcast of what this will be, to actually, give you a bit of a rundown. Actually, obviously, being a former ufologist, you work for the MOD, you're a journalist and an author, discussing obviously unidentified flying objects. But just for the people that are listening in, what would you say some of the works that you were undertaking at your time at the MOD?
Well, the day-to-day number one task was to investigate the new sightings as they came in. And we came into this with an open mind. We didn't come in thinking we are trying to prove or disprove the idea of alien visitation. We just came into it as a defense and national security issue, as you'd expect at the Ministry of Defense. Simply put, if there was something in our airspace, we wanted to find out what it was. And if it turned out to be, one of our own secret prototype aircraft or drones, that was something. Obviously, against the backdrop of the Cold War, we were always concerned about the Russians, but we didn't rule out the more exotic possibilities. Like I said, we just went where the data took us. Most of these things turned out to be misidentifications, aircraft lights, weather balloons, Chinese lanterns, that sort of thing. But every now and then we came across a case that had us stumped, and that was interesting.
Really, that's fascinating. So, I mean, this subject now is so fascinating to me, and trying to understand it. And there's a whole spectrum of where it goes. Now, sometimes when people talk about unidentified flying objects, they talk about alien life, and I've discussed it on radio shows that I've done before. I mean, in this vast universe, it would be silly to me anyway to think that there wasn't anything else out there. But for some reason, it's very difficult for people to take it on. And if you was to say, obviously, you have historically the Roswell incidents and things like that, and talking about that, and you'd be sort of cast as a conspiracy theorist. But is there, as you say, there's not much substance to some of the stuff that you've seen, or what people say? Is the vast majority of what people say, is it incorrect, or what incidences have you come up against that have been completely genuine and you thought, well, is there any actual evidence that you've got to say, okay, that's 100% definitely not of this planet?
Well, there's no 100% certain extraterrestrial smoking gun, or if there is, I'm afraid I haven't seen it. And I was the person handling this. So I think I would have had, both in terms of my security clearance and my need to know, I would have had access to that. So we haven't got one of these things, as some conspiracy theorists think, hidden away in a aircraft hangar somewhere. But I mean, just to pick up on what you said, I think most of the people that see and report these things, they're not crazy, they're not hoaxers. They are genuine people who have seen something that genuinely perplexes them. But in most cases, they have made a mistake. They've perhaps there are unusual atmospheric conditions, some normal object and phenomena just appears to be behaving in an unusual way. And it could be something like at a big rock concert or something. Sometimes you have very powerful lasers and searchlights. In some meteorological conditions, these can reflect off like fog, mist, low cloud, and you can get the idea that there are incandescent disc-shaped craft chasing each other around the skies, whereas in fact you're dealing with one of these sky tracker machines or whatever they're called. So, I mean, yeah, it's not that these people are stupid or hoaxers or anything. They're well-intentioned, but just incorrect. But the great thing about this subject is that the skeptics have to be right every day, but the believers only need to be right one single time, and everything changes. And to answer your question about cases on my watch that maybe couldn't be explained in these conventional terms, we had a great one that took place over a series of about 6 hours in March of 1993, where a vast triangular-shaped craft was seen operating over several different parts of the UK, phenomenal speeds, incredible maneuvers. 2 Air Force bases were directly overflown, multiple police and military witnesses, one of whom described this thing about 200 feet above the ground, low frequency humming sound coming from it, maybe some sort of unusual engine propulsion system, whatever, we didn't know. And then from a very slow speed of maybe 30 or 40 miles an hour, it accelerated away to the horizon in an instant. And when I spoke to the witness the following day, he said, "Nick, I've been 8 years in the Air Force. I've never seen anything like this before."
Wow, that's incredible. Was that similar, Nick, to the object they see floating above the ocean recently, which kicked this all off again? And I know Joe Rogan spoke about it, and I think the US Air Force picked it up on radar, and you see this object floating above the ocean at the untold amount of speed, and they said this is definitely not of this earth. Do you know anything into that?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know if there's a similarity, any connection between that incident, or rather those series of incidents, and the case that I just described in the UK. But those US Navy videos that you mentioned are absolutely fascinating. And what's great about them is that there is zero doubt that they are authentic. And if anyone thinks otherwise, the point is that the Pentagon itself put out a press release saying, look, to clear up all the debate about this, these are genuine United States Navy videos, and the phenomenon shown remain unidentified. And what was really interesting about it is that following that, there was a series of classified briefings in Congress, and a number of people who had that briefing were very shaken up about it and demanded some action. So at the moment, for example, here in the US, where I now live, the Senate Intelligence Committee has demanded a report on this from Director of National Intelligence. And Senator Marco Rubio, who sits as acting chair of that committee, has said, look, I would rather this is extraterrestrial than Russian or Chinese technology, because if it's Russian or Chinese, they have made some sort of quantum leap advance that has left the United States standing.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and of course, if they've developed some sort of technology that's enabled to go into obviously their territory, it's be incredibly alarming, especially if the communist states they are now, and especially where it's going. But I mean, you could talk about this subject forever, and it's such a wide spectrum. Did you ever look into Bob Lazar and his dealings that he had? Obviously, he's got a Netflix documentary now, and he's obviously been on Joe Rogan as well. And he was touched on where he had worked at Area 51, or a branch off of Area 51, and he claimed that he discovered these technologies. And with your expertise and what's your 2 cents on him, or do you even know who he is?
Yes, I think I met him once.
Right,
I've obviously, I'm familiar with his claims. He does check out in one respect. There is very strong evidence that he did indeed work at Area 51 for a time in the 80s as a contractor. But as to his other claims, that he worked on these back-engineered extraterrestrial craft that we maybe got at Roswell in 1947 and have been trying to figure out ever since. That, as they say in the intelligence analysis community, is interesting if true, but unfortunately, I can't evaluate whether it's true or not. And I mentioned earlier that my security clearance and my need to know. What we don't have to this day is much international cooperation. So you won't find, for example, the US and the UK talking to each other as much as you might think they would or should be doing on this. So I can't really evaluate Bob Lazar's claims, but they're out there, and we'll see. I think with this Senate Intelligence Committee interest that I mentioned, I suspect that they'll be getting into some of this, because the first thing they want to know is what other parts of the US government have been doing work on this. Who knows what, right across the military intelligence community and the public, the private sector, because of course a lot of this was put out through a contract, maybe to make it a little bit more difficult for people to get their hands on under Freedom of Information Act. But Bigelow Aerospace, for example, picked up the Pentagon's ATIP contract, which was Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
Wow. I mean, because you're picking up on it now, and obviously the investigation they're doing internally and how they don't coincide internationally as well. And I remember looking at in the Canadian Defence Minister, obviously he made a very famous statement. I could be wrong. It was certainly, he worked for the Canadian government. He stood up in their parliament and said, well, I call it parliament, but said that obviously the US government had been holding secret intelligence to say that they have been in contact with alien life. Again, we're just surmising, but there's obviously no concrete proof. But what I want to ask you is, do you believe that the government, in particular the US government, or could you clear up any contact with the the UK government? Do you believe there's been any contact previously? And they're obviously keeping it under wraps for the reasons being that obviously if the public was to find out, there'll be some form of hysteria to it and panic, and just to, if we ever did find that out, it could potentially, upset the apple cart, as it were.
Well, that's interesting, because I guess if we were facing literally an alien invasion, I totally accept that there'd be panic in the streets. But if you flip it around and you simply say, well, how would the people react if you told them extraterrestrial life exists? I think a lot of people would be quite calm about it, because you don't scare people by telling them something they already believe. And I think opinion polls consistently show a fairly high level of belief in all this. So I don't think that panic in the streets, if we're dealing with hostile aliens, absolutely. But if not, I think there are other reasons for UFO secrecy. One big reason goes back to this point that if the US government has known about all this, say since 1947 and Roswell, while there isn't any legal or constitutional problem with the US government saying, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. You switch on the TV, you see the president say that one evening. If the follow-up question is, well, Mr. President, that's great, but I guess my next question is, why have you lied about this for nearly 80 years? That takes you to some more difficult territory. And so maybe those sorts of issues lie behind secrecy, as does the issue of technology acquisition. I mean, if Bob Lazar's right, if there is alien tech out there, I mean, you consider it almost like a new space race. The United States, Russia, China, all trying to be first to get their hands on it, or if they have it already, figure it out. And the first person to figure that out is going to be, top dog for the foreseeable future. So that is another good reason why you might not want to show your hand. If you consider this like a high stakes card game. Why would you want the other players to see your cards?
No, it's a very, very good point. And obviously, Bob Lazar stated that there were certain technologies that the American government were working with that was so advanced, and was obviously creating gravity and things like that, and which was incredible. And as you say, if different countries actually took advantage of them technologies, and then it would just change the whole face of the way we live, if it's true, of course. But going back to your work, Nick, so I remember looking at something that there was an event, I believe it was in Ireland. Don't quote me on this. I'm sure you'll know about it. It was meant to be one of the most concrete pictures ever seen, and it was given to UK intelligence. And you may have even come across it. And it was a picture. Well, it was a depiction of a picture because we never actually saw the footage. But it was meant to be one of the most famous sightings ever, that was meant to be most genuine sighting, which I believe was in Scotland or Ireland. I'll get my editor to put a clip up of it. But are you aware of it? The location that I'm actually talking about?
Yes, it's actually Scotland, and it's Calveen near Pitlochry. And this was a huge diamond-shaped craft, sort of battleship grey in color, taken in broad daylight. In fact, it was a series of 6 photos. And to cut a long story short, the Ministry of Defense, we managed, or rather, it was my predecessors. This was my time on the UFO program was 91 to 94. This happened in 1990. So I'm going to plead not guilty on this one. But suffice to say, somebody managed to make the photos and the negatives mysteriously disappear, except for the copies that we had. But obviously, this was going to run as a big media story, and then it didn't. But we had a blown up poster-sized enlargement of the best photo on our office wall for years. And then my head of division at one point said, you know what, I don't think we should have this on display, even though it's not in public, but even in Ministry of Defense headquarters building, because we don't know what other people's security clearances are. So he said, I'm going to treat this as a top secret document. And so he locked it in his safe. And then when he retired, and when the Ministry of Defense began its program to declassify and release most of its UFO files, including many of the ones that I wrote, this was mysteriously missing. And the story recently, the Sun got an exclusive on this, that the Ministry of Defense had decided to keep the original file closed, I think for another 70 years or something like that.
Wow. That's incredible.
I shouldn't laugh, because people, the UFO community are understandably pretty aggrieved about this. But, you know, I only laugh because it's just the way it is in government. It's like another 50 years secrecy, another 100 years. Yes, why not?
And it was because obviously it's genuine. Is that the reason?
Yes, the photograph was looked at by our intelligence community imagery analysis specialists, and they concluded that these were real photographs. They showed a real solid object, and that was about it. It's one of these cases that until or unless some new piece of evidence comes forward, people will probably never really know. But yeah, a genuine mystery to this day, and one of those cases that gives one pause for thought.
Well, that's fascinating, and just touching again on your work. So, you know, when you was dealing with ufology and unidentified flying objects, working for the Ministry of Defense, what prompts you to get involved in a certain sighting or situation? I mean, I'm only guessing that you must have hundreds, maybe thousands of people that come forward and contact the government or contact the powers that be and say, I've seen something. What prompted you to undertake an investigation, or who you was working with to undertake an investigation? How does the process work?
Well, the Ministry of Defense has, first came across this during the Second World War when a number of pilots on bombing raids reported being shadowed by strange objects or craft. And at first, they thought this was some sort of German secret weapon, but after the war, it transpired that German and Japanese pilots had seen same sorts of things. They'd assumed it was the Allies, and some other cases. But starting in 1953, the Ministry of Defense formalized this, and the United States Air Force already had a program codenamed Project Blue Book, which was looking at this. So we followed very much the methodology of the United States on this. And over the years, many different people have done that job, usually for about 2, 3, 4 years before we get posted to another position. It's just the standard sort of civil service merry-go-round of postings. I didn't have a previous interest or belief in this. I was just given this to do as my next government job, and it was one of several different jobs I had in a much longer 21-year career. But when it comes to the witnesses, it's really events-led. In many cases, there's going to be very little meaningful investigation that you can do. Sometimes, for example, somebody will come to you and tell you about a sighting that happened years before, but they'll see a TV show or something. It will prompt them to come forward. They won't even remember the date. And obviously, in a circumstance like that, there's nothing you can do meaningfully. But, or if somebody says, look, I saw a bright light and then there was a green light and a red light on either side of it, and it was fairly near Heathrow Airport. Well, yeah. And I'm talking, we did get those sorts of reports, seriously. Well, so sometimes you just take a quick look and you think that's all the investigation you need. You know what it is. But in other cases, you have to dig deeper. And we actually got into some really heated debates about this, because there was a faction that said we should be filtering these reports. And you're right, we got, over the years, we had thousands of these. In any given year, somewhere between 200-300 and maybe 700-800, something like that. So some people wanted to filter them and say, look, if it's come from the public or if it's vague, just forget about it. But if it's from our own people, pilots, radar operators, military personnel, then we should really look at it. But the other faction said, no, that's not how intelligence works. In intelligence, it's like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, and you never know what little piece that may seem unimportant, that you may think is inconsequential, turns out to be significant. So don't let's filter the reports. And this argument went back and forward for years.
Well, I think that explained that. And yeah, it must be extremely difficult exercise to try and filter through some of the people that come in and about certain unidentified flying objects. And I was going to ask you as well, because you touched on it, on a few cases that you had when you worked at the MOD, and tell me if you're unable to answer the question, but are you allowed to speak of incidences that you see or was working on? Obviously you didn't see, but was working on in particular areas in the UK. Are you allowed to say that still?
Yes, I mean, the Ministry of Defense has itself declassified and released most of these files. And in fact, I came out of retirement to help with that program and to make the official announcement for the National Archives. But and most of it's out. Around 60,000 pages of documents have now been declassified and released, and most of them released pretty much unredacted. Obviously, there are some things that are blacked out. Sometimes it's just something as simple as someone's name and address and personal details under data protection exemptions. So other times it's something that might disclose, I don't know, methods and sources of gathering intelligence, the capability of military radar systems, that sort of thing. But the files are out there, and yeah, so I can talk about a lot of it, and people can see a lot of this for themselves. And it's at the National Archives. It's also on a website in the United States called blackvault.com, where people can get these files free of charge and have a look through them. We did get hotspots. It's funny, people think that when it comes to different areas of the UK, people think it's going to be the remote areas. It's actually not. London's the #1 UFO hotspot. But of course, what you then have to do is factor in population density. So it's like, well, yeah, if there's 10 million people in London or whatever the figure is, and there's something strange in the sky, there's a much higher possibility that a number of people will see it than if it's in a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere.
No, exactly. And I can imagine there's so much going on in an urbanized environment, in particular London. You've got things flying around everywhere. But is there any specific actual incidents, though? Like there was one object or one case that you dealt with and you were just sort of gobsmacked and it was sort of unsolved and you just thought, wow, this is just unbelievable.
Yes, the Rendlesham Forest incident, which is probably Britain's best known UFO case. Now, this was before my time. This was 1980, but I did a cold case review of this. So, just like every now and then, the cops will kind of try and take an old case and have another go at it, see if they can crack it, particularly if it's a high-profile one that there was a lot of heat on them to solve it. So this was the case with Rendlesham, and this wasn't lights in the sky. The allegation was that something landed, and that this was a series of incidents over 3 consecutive nights in December 1980 in Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, which lies between 2 United States Air Force bases, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. And the witnesses included, on the 3rd night, the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. So, and dozens of military witnesses in all. And as I say, on the 1st night, some of the military personnel saw this thing briefly land in a clearing in the forest and then take off again. There were burn marks on the sides of the trees, indentations in the hard frozen ground, and radioactivity levels, which the Defense Intelligence staff in the Ministry of Defense assessed as seeming significantly higher than the average background levels. And it was tracked briefly on radar. So there was a wealth of evidence for this. And over the years, I met and interviewed most of the witnesses. I've been to the site several times. It is genuinely, and we've just passed the 40th anniversary of this case. And it's sometimes called Britain's Roswell, not because it crashed. I mean, this was, as I say, a brief touchdown of something, but it's called Britain's Roswell just because it is, I guess, the flagship case in the UK, still unexplained to this day. And again, as I say, the file's out there. So people can read this for themselves, and it's quite a read.
I will. I'll make sure I'll have a look into that. I really will. And it's really interesting actually to speak to you obviously about these incidents. And I just wanted to sort of ask you, being sort of in the know, you've been in the government, working in the MOD, dealing with unidentified objects as amongst other things. Do you believe in it all, or do you not? Do you think that of some of the stuff you've seen, do you think that there is life on Earth, alien life on Earth present? And do you think that, a second question, that we have made contact? What do you think, being from an educated point of view?
I'm convinced there's life out there in the universe, other life, some biological, some post-biological, machine intelligence, AI, things like that. And when we do encounter aliens, I think it's just as likely that we'll be dealing with robots and AI, sentient AI, than say flesh and blood biologicals. So I'm convinced there's life out there. Whether we're being visited or not, I don't know. I'm open-minded. I'd love it to be true. I think the world would be much more interesting with aliens than without, but I don't want to mislead people. I haven't seen a smoking gun that proves it beyond reasonable doubt. So all I can really say about visitation is I'm open-minded. I've yet to see definitive, you can take it to the bank kind of proof, but I've seen certainly some of the sorts of things that we've discussed, whether it's Rendlesham, whether it's the case from 93 that I mentioned, whether it's these US Navy videos, certainly things like that. It's quite difficult to see it in other terms. And I mentioned Senator Marco Rubio said, I hope it's not the Russians or the Chinese. Some other people in the military intelligence community have been far more forthright and have said, it isn't the Russians and Chinese. We know what we've got. We know what they've got. This seems to be something else, something above and beyond. So I don't know. We are, this subject, honestly, in the last 3 or so years has really come out of the fringe and into the mainstream in a way that I've not seen before. So many exciting things happening, a lot of them in the United States, with some of the things I mentioned, like the Director of National Intelligence producing this report, which has to be out by late June, Senate Intelligence Committee, Armed Services Committee, really pushing for answers on this. We really are in exciting times for this subject, and more government files, both in the US and the UK, set to be released this year as well. So a lot going on for sure.
It's so interesting, and I'm the same as you. I'm incredibly open-minded. I think maybe, obviously, with what's going on with the government, but I think the public in general are more sort of open-minded and ready for it now. And if we was to ever get that television, well, would we have Boris Johnson coughing and spluttering on the TV screen saying that there's alien life? I can't ever visualize that, but with what's gone on this year, I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, I mean, I know some of the work that you've done now, and obviously you've got your own podcast, and you're a journalist and author in what you do, and you've interviewed some people that have been abducted or claim to have been abducted, and genuinely believe that they have. What's it like interviewing people like that, talking to the people that are actually convinced that they have been in contact?
Oh, it's fascinating. And I'm always reminded of the classic quote from the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where they say, what is it about these people who are being drawn somehow to Devil's Tower? And the answer is, well, I don't know, but they seem to be ordinary people in extraordinary situation. And that's, I think, how I would characterize these abduction claims. There doesn't seem to be any psychopathology about them. I mean, and of course, it's easy for the skeptics to say, oh, they're just crazy. Well, there was a very famous professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School called John Mack, who decided to test that. And I mean, this guy was a Pulitzer Prize winner. And he looked at a number of these people and he said, look, as a professor of psychiatry, I can tell you there is no psychopathology about these people, and neither do any of the other motivations that one sees really stack up. I mean, these people aren't, generally speaking, attention seekers. For every high-profile person who wants to tell their story, there are hundreds who don't, or if they speak at all, will only do so using a pseudonym. So it's not attention seeking. As I mentioned, it's not psychopathology. These are people with not much to gain, and I think conversely, a lot to lose by coming out with these reports. Again, can we prove any of this? No, we can't. Should we be studying it more? Absolutely, because as I mentioned right at the beginning, if just one of these cases, whether we're talking about UFOs or alien abductions, if just a single case turns out to be the real deal, our world is a fundamentally different world to the world that a lot of people think we're living in. Everything would have to be reassessed. We'd have to rewrite everything.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that day. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. I really wouldn't. Because obviously you're out in Arizona now, living in America, and you're still working on unidentified flying objects, and obviously you podcast journalist, etc. And everyone dealing or investigating this subject as a layman, you hear Area 51, you hear of the Roswell incident. From an investigative point of view, what have you? Is there any substance to them incidents? I know Area 51 exists. Most of it's underground. Is that where they test for alien life and do the same stuff that you did for the MOD here? Is that going on?
We really don't know what's going on at Area 51. And of course, ever since Area 51 became part of almost pop culture, it's so well known. I can't help but suspect that the game might have moved somewhere else. So the real question isn't what's going on at Area 51. It's what about Area 52, 53, and 54? And where are they? And what's happening there? And Roswell, again, just as you think there's nothing else to be discovered on Roswell, something new and unexpected comes to light. And I think I happen to know that there are one or two things coming later this year on Roswell that are going to perhaps change people's minds on that. I've been to both these places. I do a lot of TV shows like Ancient Aliens and The Basement Office. I covered the whole Let's Storm Area 51 event for Ancient Aliens back when that happened in 2019. So that was interesting culturally. I've been to Roswell, of course. It's gone from being a dairy town to being a town where tourism is a big part of it now, and it's deeply entwined with the culture there. Of course, there's nothing really to see there, or is there? Maybe there is stuff and it's still waiting to be discovered. Still, after all this time, there's confusion about where exactly the crash site, or rather perhaps multiple crash sites, were. Some people think there were two crashes. Some people think something came in at a very shallow angle and skimmed, almost like bounced and then crashed. That would give you two or more crash sites. So yeah, I've been to these places. There's not necessarily anything for the public to see, but if people, when we're out of the pandemic and everyone's traveling and mingling again, I would urge people to go to Roswell for their summer UFO festival. It's really quite something to see. There's a parade down Main Street. Everyone has fun in costumes, but they have a museum as well, and there's a serious side to it too. So it's great, and it is, whatever you think of it, it's part of pop culture now, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way.
Well, it's shedding light on the situation anyway, and there's so many people that believe now, especially in America and Roswell. There's the Roswell incident, so many films, so many DVDs about it and out now, and that really is sort of like the most famous sort of scene in history, really. But you know, Nick, I'm conscious of the time here because we've already done 40 minutes on Zoom, and it automatically cuts off. I just want to make sure, where can people find you for your podcasts and books, etc., that you've done?
NickPope.net is my website. That links to my social media. Twitter is NickPope MOD. That's where I make most of my announcements. So, and as I say, shows like The Basement Office, Ancient Aliens, it's all out there.
Fantastic. Nick Pope, thank you so much for coming on and joining me today. It's been fascinating, and hopefully down the line, if anything kicks off, we can do another one of these shows and speak to you again.
Sure thing. Thanks. It's been great chatting to you.
Thank you very much, Nick Pope. Thank you.